Okay. Well, let's start back in so that we can get everybody home at a reasonable hour. The goal of this panel, is in part to conclude what it all means, but a rather more directed sense. We're hoping to write a series of concrete recommendations of particularly striking information needs, ways of collecting best management practices, and particularly information needs for management of invasive species in the Delta. And those information needs can be on drivers, how salinity is going to move with climate change. They can be on, citizen science, what we know collectively that we can't do at the individual scientist or agency level. They can be, and therefore the needs of information sharing among dispersed contributors. They can be on actually finding out what works with data. What a concept. So we're going to ask you as a group, after some initial observations, to contribute to what you would write in recommendations for programmatic and particularly information needs in terms of advancing the kinds of goals that we were talking about today. I'll note that up on the board is a conceptual model of how all this hangs together that's put up mainly for the purposes of discussion. And this is an improved model over the one I printed out and put out front, but it's similar. And so this is it's kind of a framework for ways these things might hang together. So I'm going to just ask the panelists to introduce themselves briefly and their connection, at least the two you haven't heard from yet, and then ask Lars to sort of launch a way of thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve. So, gentlemen.
Good afternoon. You hear me all right? I'm Lars Anderson. A little bit of background. I retired from USDA ARS about 3 years ago, and part of our mission in the research program was to develop management programs for the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta. So my first experience was in the early 1980s, and first of all, it's really great to see the interest in the Delta system and management in general. But there were probably 12 of us around the table with Boating and Waterways at that time trying to figure out how to control water hyacinth in 1981. With the technology that was out there and the experience from Florida, and you guys out in Florida were doing it for quite a while before that. So this is really, things have gone a long way since then. Unfortunately, so have the plants. and so have the species that have come into the Delta. And I think that with the model you see up on the screen there, you can see there's a lot of complexity to the Delta. I think one of the things that strikes me in the discussions today is that we talk about the Delta as if it's a unit, but it's a whole suite or an array of communities of various types. And one of the things I think we can do, and it occurred to me as we were discussing this over lunch a little bit, is that we need to look more at a more tailored fashion at the habitat and the communities that are in the Delta. The Deepwater Channel is very different from Oxbow Sloughs. It's very different from White Slough, Disappointment Slough, Sand Mountain Slough. So we have to take a careful look at this. And I know that over the last years, Boating and Waterways has tried to focus their treatments in priority areas based on several criteria. But I think the thing that strikes me is that we've got new plants coming in. We have sponge plant that we first saw in 2007. Putting a rapid response together didn't happen. It took almost 5 to 7 years to get something going. And so my feeling is that what we ought to do perhaps is take a look at the system at an ecosystem level, not just each plant that's coming in or each new species we're concerned about, but look at the system in total. And that means, of course, not just the plants, but the relationship between plants, the inverts, and the fish as well. And I think the other thing that strikes me is that there's a lot of technology today that we didn't have even 10 years ago. And I see this as very encouraging in terms of taking approaches to the Delta management in a different way than we have been in the past. We can talk about some other details. The other major thing that I think seemed to have not been mentioned too much, and that is the fact that somewhere between now and the next 20 to 50 years, we're going to see a lot more seawater in the Delta. It's going to compress the freshwater habitat. It's going to compress the presence of freshwater plants and animals in general. And it may also bring in some marine invasive species that we really haven't talked about today as well. So those are kind of my overviews at this point, and I'll pass it on to Trevor.
Thanks, Lars. My name is Josh Viers. I'm an associate professor at the University of California, Merced. Some of you may know me for having been on this campus prior to going to UCM, and was here for quite a while. In fact, I sat in the back of this classroom in 1991. Wendy Silk was teaching her water and society class. She started off the quarter by doing a rendition of Itsy Bitsy Spider, went up the water spout. And you could imagine a bunch of undergrads kind of cocking their head and wondering what happened to the spider. I was wondering what happened to the water. And I guess I've been thinking about that ever since, and I'm now co-leading the University of California's Water Security and Sustainability Research Initiative, which is really kind of focused on this idea of water accounting information systems, and getting back to that point that you can't manage what you don't measure. And I think that's true not just for water, but also for aquatic weeds and organisms that we desire and perhaps want to get rid of. So with that in mind, there were three brief things that I wanted to touch on based on the presentations that we saw earlier today. One on new technologies, two on citizen science, and three reconciling successes and failures. With respect to new technologies, as Lars mentioned, it wasn't shortly after that class that Anitra hired me to look at TMDL data from the state, and we were having a hard time making heads and tails of it then, and I certainly think we're probably a little better at it now, but not as far as we'd like to be. Some of the new technologies we've seen today, talking about Landsat 8 and remote sensing, and certainly Shruti talking about some of the hyperspectral data. I will put in a short plug for another symposium 1 week from today on the Davis campus, UAVs for water management. So unmanned aerial vehicles or drones being used throughout the state for water management purposes. I'll be on that panel as well, talking about the use of aerial drones. In some cases, we're using hexcopters, outfitted with LiDAR systems to do, terrain mapping. In other cases, we're starting to extend the battery life on some of these fixed-wing craft and outfitted with hyperspectral sensors. And so getting back to that early detection, signature libraries of certain species being able to do overflights on a fairly rapid basis. So as opposed to the 16-day intervals, we could do that on a more regular basis. There are trade-offs, of course, with any new technology, the cost associated with them, the time to get up to speed and using them, and then the volume of data that's collected and having to sift through it. Secondly, on the citizen science thing, I've been quite successful working with Earthwatch Institute. Some of you may know them. They're based out of the East Coast, but they're a global organization that put citizens out in the field doing science with scientists, and they've initiated a program called Sierra to the Sea, and they're looking for folks that have projects in need of volunteers. My suggestion is working with a group like that takes care of all the logistics, which are really difficult to pull off if you're trying to focus on many other things. I would also suggest as a recommendation that having a database as a back end before you start is also important, because once they start collecting those data, it's important that there's a way to capture it, which also leads to this idea that you don't always have 4G LTE connections everywhere you are in the state, sometimes not in the Delta, especially not in the high Sierras. So thinking about the mechanism in which you capture those data, sometimes electronically, isn't always best, and being able to follow up. Lastly, on the successes and failures, I guess, one of the successes that we've had more in the terrestrial riparian realm with invasive species and looking at perennial pepperweed, Lepidium latifolium in particular, is developing a conceptual model about its life history and using empirical observations to help kind of inoculate that model and make some management decisions. I think the failure in our case, in retrospect, is that we had a fairly nice management recommendation for wet year, dry year dynamics with pepperweed. If it's a wet year, you might want to focus on the upstream populations to prevent them from moving downstream, and dry years at your specific location to keep it from proliferating. What we weren't really thinking about were 4 and 10-year long dry spells. And then now with an impending El Nino, thinking about what we could have done this past summer before that brewed. So this lends itself to, despite our thinking and strategizing about all these things, increasingly we're going to be faced with extreme events. Some of those are going to be from Mother Nature. Some of those are going to be human-engineered big events. And so we have to be thinking about managed ecosystems, what we're managing for, where, when, and why. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
All right. Jeff Shart. I wrote a few notes down before Lars started talking, and then he said, repeated a few things or said a few things that I would have written down, so I'll probably repeat a few of those. But I'll go back to my presentation, and the first thing I would say is to identify the uses of the system or the various uses within the system. Like Lars said, it's a big ecosystem with a lot of small components in them that are very different from one another. So identify what those uses are, and then following up on what Mike had said before is identify what the outcome is that you want in each of those areas. Map the system to see what you have out there presently and report on that. And a lot of times people get caught up in reporting on what the problems are, but they don't bother reporting on the successes as they start managing. And that's especially important to keep a program going, to keep funding going, because legislatures need to know that money is going to a worthwhile cause. So as you start implementing programs, if you start implementing programs, when you start implementing programs, make sure you're also documenting the successes that you're having, and the only way you can document successes is to document what the issues are when you get started. Make sure that your management decisions or the way you want to proceed to manage is based on science. We always tell people focus on the weeds, not on your personal preference or personal biases, and focus on the ecosystem, not what you want or not what the small part of that ecosystem use is to you. For example, not just the fisheries or not just the waterfowls. Don't be an advocate for just one thing, but understand that there's trade-offs. For anything that you manage, you're also going to have some sort of an impact on something else out in that system. Or anything you don't manage or anything you delay in management is going to have some sort of impact on something else in that system eventually. So if you do start managing plants, the best time to start managing plants is now, before they become problems, or a time of year before they are less responsive to your management options. A lot of times in Florida, our experience is that people don't want us controlling plants during the fish spawn or during duck hunting season. So that leaves us managing plants at times of year where we're not very effective at controlling the target, and we have more impacts on non-target species in that system, and then people say, I told you so. Well, they set up the conditions for you to fail, and you've stepped right into those. So you need to convey that to all the stakeholders, are that we hear you, we understand what your concerns are in this system. Here's what perhaps would happen if we follow that line of work, or here's what would happen if we don't go out and do something. So again, follow the science, not the single focus advocates and not the personal preferences. Don't use herbicides just because that's something you're familiar with. Don't discard using herbicides simply because you don't feel comfortable with using herbicides. Follow the science. And then one thing I did see that is going to be very difficult if you've got multiple entities who are responsible, and we'll leave the accountability going, but we've noticed that in Florida, things just struggled when there were multiple agencies that had responsibilities, and in that case, what's everybody's business is nobody's business, because nobody was accountable for overseeing the entire project and making sure that the outcomes that you work so hard to develop are never achieved because, well, we did our part, but some one unit seems like they have to be in charge of the whole oversight of the process to make sure that you achieve those outcomes.
Are you done? No, Jeff and I have worked together for many, many years, but I'll probably take a more pedestrian approach here. I think the biggest thing that I heard that I didn't expect to hear in coming to this meeting is that you've got what I would consider already a Ludwigia issue on the Delta. And based on what we've seen in Florida, I don't know that it's too far gone, but it will be if you don't address it fairly quick. At least know how much you have, where it's distributed, and it sounds like you're partially on your way there. It's a much harder plant to control, but at least in terms of what we've seen with it is, I see it as taking good habitat and turning it into rank monoculture. And it's one of the few that I've seen do that on a pretty consistent basis. So I guess that was the biggest thing that just really gave me kind of a, whoa, that's a lot of Ludwigia out here. In terms of, the herbicide use, I know it's not popular with everyone. I remember coming into this field 28 years ago and sitting in meetings like this and being told that, we won't be using herbicides 5 years from now. And we won't be using herbicides 5 years from, and I'm to the point where I realize, they're around to stay, in my mind. I don't think that if we solve the water hyacinth problem with a biocontrol, something's coming in its place, and it's not going to have a biocontrol. So I think you need to keep them around, certainly use them wisely. You can, my experience is you can use them unwisely. And like Jeff said, I think sometimes we fall into that trap as managers is we get kind of pigeonholed into this is how you have to use them. When as a manager, it's not the best way to use them. And I think, you really do have to continue to try to negotiate with your interagency groups. And I think it's great to see Boating and Waterways funding independent studies on some of the invertebrate work that I think will give people, you're never going to answer every question, but I think it may start to give people a little bit of confidence that, that you can use these things in a manner that's compatible with the other organisms in the system. So, from my perspective, I think overall you're doing a good job. I asked at lunch, do you guys manage hyacinth based on stakeholder needs, or you do manage hyacinth to control hyacinth? And what I meant by that was, if you're managing hyacinth to control hyacinth, you'll go about doing it in a pretty different way in terms of where you would seek it out and where you would try to control it, versus if you're doing it based on stakeholder needs, you're going to go to the person that's screaming the loudest, and that may not have the desired system-wide impacts that you want. And, and I think the experience that I've had is that if you can get over the hump on the system-wide impact aspect of things, it's painful in some ways. It does take a lot of work and in some cases a lot of herbicide. But if you can get over that hump, the outcome is that you tend to use a lot less and you have a lot less pressure from the public on the back end because you're managing in a different way. But if you're continually kind of on that hump and always kind of responding to, the loudest screaming group, it will probably always be a little bit painful. So, the Delta's complex. I can't say that you could even get there, but I think if you kind of think about it in terms of, where are the nurseries for these plants, and can we really go after these nurseries? And those nurseries may be in a place where there's no people. And, but in my mind, that for successful management, I think that's where you have to go.
I just want to follow up on a couple of comments I think are really important. And I think the other thing that struck me today was, and I appreciate Patrick's presentation on biological control, one of the things that's been a little bit disappointing to me after leaving ARS, and that is that we actually, over the history of USDA ARS, we've been one of the drivers in developing and seeking out new biocontrol agents in countries where the original countries where the pests have been from, including aquatic plants that are weeds here. And having been in Argentina and Brazil several times looking for potential biocontrol for Regaria and observing multiple insects doing a really good job on Ludwigia species, which they have many there. It is important, I think, that in terms of sustainability and long-term view is to continue to look for some of these. I agree with Mike, it's going to be a tough one to get a hold of and to control Ludwigia with our current methodologies. It's going to be very tough. I think we need to look way ahead, and it's one of the things. It's the same as anything else. You're going to have 100 trials and one winner maybe. But if you don't make that first 100 attempts to find the right agent and to get the data that shows efficacy and host specificity, you're never going to find an answer. And I want to point out that biocontrol can really work. We had 500 miles of canal filled with hydrilla in the Imperial Valley in Southern California. 2 years after the grass carp was introduced, we had reduced it by about 95%. That's a biological control agent that was a key component of the hydrilla eradication program in the irrigation system in Southern California. And so it can work. Granted, that's a very different kind of approach. It's a non-selective biocontrol agent, but I think it's important to invest heavily, but importantly, to invest wisely in alternative methods, including biological control.
Moderator's prerogative here, and comment that struck me as a data guy listening to much of what we heard today, that there's another underpinning, this may be another symposium, that on what information we need and what information infrastructure we could build. I think a lot of this is low-hanging fruit. So we heard several calls for, if we're, not only do we need to do science in terms of doing risk assessment, and we have good risk assessment models. They're working out pretty well. What's not so clear we have is a sort of underlying available everywhere data structure, sensor networks that are coordinated so that the same things are being measured in different places, that they're all going to some place in some kind of format where they can be pulled together. And a lot of that's really simple. It's the reporters, who, where, what, when, and you just have to use the same terms. So there's a lot of opportunity in order to find it, to document what works, in doing a little bit of tweaking to the information we use to find that out. And I think a lot of people in this room have a great interest in making that all work a little bit better. So I'd ask you to kind of address that kind of information need, as well as the kind of issues that our panel just identified. Having said that, what I'd like to do is open up the floor to questions and comments, and take it where you will.
Thank you.
Hi.
I'm Jim Allen. I'm the Solano County Ag Commissioner and the current president of the California Ag Commissioners Association. And I think that you're missing a key management action in your chart up here, that we don't have pest exclusion on there. And I think that that's probably because during the recent economic downturn, we've had a lot of cuts to pest exclusion programs, that we've cut the terminal inspection programs, we've cut the California border stations. But I think you could make a strong argument that the best pest prevention dollar you can spend is the dollar you spend keeping the pests out of the ecosystem in the first place. And we don't currently have hydrilla in the Delta ecosystem. We have it in other parts of the state. Preventing it from penetrating to the Delta is really important. But we also don't have alligator weed, a half dozen species of limnobium, a lot of other invasives. And it's those detection programs that have been defunded that could interdict some of these things before they ever hit the Delta ecosystem. And I really think that I'd just like to have that added to the chart. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? I'm Ted Gross-Holtz, as I introduced before. That raises the issue that one of the pieces I think that we talked about having in going forward with this is a more formal economic analysis of all this. I mean, dollars are really what drives this, and obviously there's quite a bit at stake throughout the waterways, throughout the delta. And obviously this costs quite a bit. And of course, pest exclusion, as we all know, is really one of the most cost-effective ways of doing this. But I think for two reasons. One is to raise the profile of this. It would be great to have the kinds of numbers that have been sort of generated for the drought. And I think we need to sort of bring our resource economist colleagues into this. And I know there's been sort of small pieces of this, but in a much more involved way to both raise the issue by saying really what's at stake here, but then additionally thinking about, well, what are the most cost-effective of ways of approaching this too? So I'd like to really try to, I know agencies have within them, members that can do this, but I think we need to have them on these kinds of panels. We need to have that as a bigger piece of this. Thanks.
Yeah, Tom McNabb with Clean Lakes. Couple things back to what, Jeff and Mike were talking about. I mean, back in the early 80s, I guess it was 84, Lars and I were involved, with the initial water hyacinth stuff and even going through the process of getting the 2,4-D, 24C and eventually a label change for use in flowing water. And since that time, some of the regulatory agencies have slowly, been handcuffing that whole program on what, how much boating waterway is allowed to spray at one time and how many acres a year. And we move up and down the coast, and we have similar, habitats like up on the Columbia River system and places in between where, we can go treat submerged plants with 2,4-D at, 4 parts per million. We're probably using, 15 times the quantity of 2,4-D per acre on submerged, water milfoil compared to water hyacinths. And it's the same agencies, and I don't think we're getting the share of data back and forth, and and the agencies are really understanding the impacts that the water hyacinth has on the delta ecosystem, because they say, well, you can't spray too much because you're going to impact a fishery. Well, somebody doesn't understand there isn't a fishery underneath that water hyacinth mat because there's no oxygen. The thing's shredding at least twice its biomass a year and sediment in the thing. And I don't know how, Jeff, your group over the years, I think you went through similar things with the manatees and everything else in Florida, and I don't know how, between the federal agencies and the state agencies, somehow you got on the same page where if you got a problem, go deal with it before it impacts the whole ecosystem. Well, here we have a problem that we've had for 20 years, and it's, it seems to be getting worse. So I think something down the road needs to be done with that. I don't know if it's a different forum but it just seems like boating waterways every year they've been limited on what they can do, and as a result of that, the hyacinth's getting worse, and it's really it's impacting fishery and the whole delta habitat.
Okay. I'm Commuter Sagar at USGS. Thanks, this was a very interesting day. I learned something that I find kind of scary, and that is about the water primrose, Ludwigia. I knew that they were around, they have been around for quite some time. I didn't know, and I think Shruti, you showed that the most today, that they've apparently been spreading quite a bit lately, especially in the North Delta, at least that's what your map showed, which, as most folks here I'm sure know, is a very important area for habitat restoration and for some of our native species. So I'm now wondering, and also I heard several times actually that this is a worse plant, a worse weed than water hyacinth. And I actually didn't totally understand yet why it's so much worse from a management perspective or perhaps an ecological perspective. I heard something about monocultures, and they form these really dense stands or mats or beds, perhaps worse than or more so than water hyacinth. But I'd like to hear a little more about that, what makes them so bad, and also your perspective on how worried we should be here in the Delta, especially about the North Delta, and what to do, basically. Thank you.
Just a couple of comments on what makes it so difficult, and I'm sure there's others in the panel who can address that. First of all, it produces a lot of seed that sprouts annually, can sprout. Water hyacinth produces seed, but what we're seeing with that plant, and I think it was mentioned, it tends to require fluctuation in water levels and some exposure of the sediment to get high seedling production, whereas Ludwigia does not seem to require that. The other thing is that it's so well anchored and yet produces these networks of rhizomes that connect it all together that it is able to spread and stay stable in certain areas, whereas water hyacinth will move back and forth. Okay? And in addition to that, it creates a very, very dense canopy. And someone mentioned at lunch today the whole idea of hyacinth overflowing bulrushes, and it does that too. We've seen in Frank's Track and some other areas in the last 15 years or so where we have had pretty good absence of Ludwigia in the sort of early 90s or so, mid-90s. And we've seen it encroach on the shoreline and move out and basically overtop the native submerged plants that were out there, in addition to agaricus, of course. So it has a lot of attributes like that. Plus, if it breaks off and fragments, it will start a new plant population because it produces roots in the water column even before it breaks off. So it's got a lot of dispersal attributes that make it really difficult to control as well.
Just a couple of comments. You know, if you look back, way back, the Corps of Engineers got involved in invasive plant control because of water hyacinth and alligator weed. And alligator weed in many cases was considered the worst problem because it was so much harder to control. And I'd probably put primrose in that category. There's some limitations to primrose that water hyacinth doesn't have in terms of it does need to be anchored. But at least within the last 5 years in Florida, what we see is that it will take any good habitat, so be that kind of a grass. We have a lot of aquatic grasses, and it will creep through them. It looks very benign when it first gets in there. And then within a few years, it's just a monoculture of Ludwigia. So then when we come through and spray it, first thing that you notice is that it's woody tissue, so that you end up with this woody tissue for a year that does your program, not a lot of favors because everybody sees the brown and says, well, that, it looks like you're killing everything, and it's the Ludwigia killing a lot of things. But the other thing we've seen is that we're not getting a lot of recruitment of other plants. Once the Ludwigia has been there for a period of time, we can't just come in and manage it and say, well, the natives will come back, because a lot of our natives aren't coming back after they've been under those mats. So I certainly don't want to make it out to be a world-class weed like water hyacinth, in the sense that, water hyacinth's got its reputation for a good reason. It's that Ludwigia is so much harder, in my mind, to control. And, when you end up with that woody tissue, and like Lars said, there's an extensive rhizome mat under the water, trying to translocate that much herbicide into a rhizome mat versus killing a floating plant, it's exponentially harder. So you have to be more aggressive. You're going to have to spray multiple times. And basically, we're killing the top growth, and then what we're finding is the bottom growth just greens right up, and it acts like a submerged plant for a while, and then comes right back as a mat. So
yeah, that was the other thing I was going to mention. That the difference too is that with Ludwigia, it's able to transcend the water level to the wetted surface of the land right adjacent to it. So you get this continuum of production of invasive plant canopy. It doesn't just stop at the water's edge; it goes right up the bank. So it has that plasticity that we don't see in water hyacinth.
Thanks a lot. So can I ask just a real quick follow-up? You mentioned, I think, that in Florida you've seen sort of a similar increase in Ludwigia lately, and you were wondering why. But do you guys have any hypotheses, any ideas of why that is? What is it that is making the primrose come up now like that? I mean, it's been around, especially
Some thoughts,
here for a
but
while.
not any conclusive proof, because similar to what we heard in California, we found it 25 years ago in Florida, and it was not a problem anywhere. Now we have problems with it in about 45 of those public waters that all generated just within the last 4 or 5 years. But another issue with that extensive rhizome mat, maybe they're not fully explaining that. Those rhizomes can be 15, 20 feet long underwater and all curled up so that they're thick enough you can almost walk on that rhizome mat that's underwater, and that's what's causing why we don't get much recruitment from native plants. You have to physically harvest that rhizome mat out of there, And we're spending right now anywhere from $6,000 to $8,000 per acre to harvest the rhizome mat out. When you do that, you're down almost to the sediments, pulling everything up. But most of it is Ludwigia roots and rhizomes. So.
Yeah, hi, my name's Jesse Roseman. I'm the project director for the Casumnus for the Nature Conservancy, and everything you said about Ludwigia is really hitting home. We've got a tremendous problem with it, and it affects several areas of our operation. It's in the irrigation canals that we use for wetlands, and there's another conservation target, giant gartersnake, and I think there's also a question maybe of to the toxicity. Could you study it to see if applying it in more upland systems, tailwater ponds, affects snakes? Maybe from Florida's experience, you could talk about that. And then also, I think there's resource managers out there that see it as a beneficial habitat type. And clearly, maybe in limited quantities, but since for the past 5 years, I think it's invaded a lot of our tidal sloughs, wetlands, irrigation ditches, and it's become a big problem for the ag producers as well. So any efforts at addressing this and best practices is appreciated.
I'll talk about the second part first, and I alluded to that with hydrilla and water hyacinth control. With any invasive plant species, especially when it's first introduced into the system, you can find ecological services that those plants are supplying. It's later on that they cross that threshold, but when they cross that threshold, truly do start expressing their invasiveness, like Ludwigia overgrowing the other native species, or the native species that might be in that system, it's too late. That's why you need to work with the stakeholders up front. We still have, after 50 years of hydrilla, 60 years of hydrilla, and over 100 years of water hyacinth Florida, there are very strong contingents of folks who want hydrilla in systems, who want water hyacinth in the system for fishing, for waterfowl, for edge effect to fish. And then they say, well, when it becomes a problem, go out and control it. And that's always the worst time to go out and control it. So you really need to do a lot of homework up front with folks who are professing using a plant that has demonstrated invasiveness on opposite ends of the countries and probably different kinds of watersheds, but still showing the same kinds of problems. So in that case, you need to do your homework. Or even if you're working with an endangered species and it's supplying some sort of habitat for that endangered species, you need to also understand, maybe for a while, but what happens then later on. So look at the ecosystem, don't focus on the species, is what I was trying to say before.
Yeah, I was going to say Brenda Gruel, we've been funding her to work on Ludwigia, some of the biology issues and genetics and that type of thing, and we're in the final stages of getting a report that was entitled Establishing Management Priorities for Ludwigia, and I'll send that to Maggie, and then anyone, you can forward it to the group, but it's very relevant. I mean, she's here at Davis and doing the research, but I've got her interested in the Florida population because we're just seeing this synchronicity between these two invasions. And then the other big one that's going on is in France, and it's been there for quite a long time, and that's a non-managed population in the sense that they basically will not use herbicides, but they're certainly watching it move in the country and basically in Europe now. And if you're a waterfowl enthusiast and you start looking at some of the literature coming out of France, it's a very concerning plant, because it is not real kind to a lot of waterfowl that tend to use vegetation. It's too rank. So.
Yeah, I was going to comment on the snake question you had. When Boating and Waterways was putting together their first programs and dealing with the listed species, there was actually some tox studies done with giant gartersnake for the herbicides that were proposed to be used. So, it can be done, and there's some data on that, I think, that might address your question about toxicity, direct toxicity to snakes. That would be in their biological opinion from even way back in probably 2004 or 5, something like that.
Department of Water Resources. Was curious about Triploid grass carp. I know, very good in the canals, used in ponds and stuff in Florida. Are they just too blunt of an instrument to be able to be used out in the Delta? I know the Triploid pretty much cuts out reproduction. What are the chances of being able to use them, and do they like hyacinth at all?
Yeah, that's an interesting history on the triploid grass carp. If you look at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife now, their criteria is that the introductions are not going to be in areas that have natural connections to natural waterways. Well, that's number one, and the Delta is. Secondly, they have to be above the 100-year floodplain. Guess what? So to answer your question bluntly is the permit would not fit their criteria. But the other question is, the question you ask is, grass carp are pretty much eat anything when it gets down to the last vegetative kind of species, they'll eat it. And so they will chew on the roots of water hyacinth, they'll chew on the roots of anything hanging in the water if that's all they can get. But in reality, the opportunity, or rather the feasibility of using them in the Delta is pretty much zero because of current limitations, regardless of the fact that they're sterile. So that you'd have to have a major change in the state Department of Fish and Wildlife policy to have an introduction in the Delta.
But as an effective biological control.
Well, they would certainly control Aegeria pretty well, and the trouble is they're not very selective, and so what they do is they go after their most favorite species, which tends to be the pondweeds, which are native mostly, except for curly-leaf pondweed. And then they'll go up, and their least one, the least preferred is Eurasian water milfoil. So you can have this cascade effect if you ever were to do that. So there's a lot of negatives for the Delta.
Yeah, I was a little disappointed to hear about, I guess, stakeholder support in Florida, but I'm wondering if there's enough understanding on the part of boaters and fishers in California about really what, they can all see what the negative effects of these are, to sort of bring them in and make more of an investment in bringing these groups together to try to generate more support for this. Or is there sort of a split in the communities in the same way? And so is there enough understanding on the part of, broadly boaters and fishers? And if we don't know, maybe we need to bring them in then.
I can tell you if the experience of Tahoe teaches us anything, there's not enough information that's out there at this point. I think we talked about that a little further, about getting the public more engaged through citizen science. I mean, there's a program at Tahoe called Eyes on the Lake. We need one that's Eyes on the Delta, that kind of approach. Boating and Waterways has done a pretty good job about some of these things. Their Dock Walkers program, we're looking for pollution from boats and so on. And they could expand that. I mean, again, it takes resources to do this, to help educate the public on what to look for, how to report it, and so on. But I think there's a gap there right now.
Yeah, to kind of follow on with the stakeholder issue, in addition to flying drones, we're in the process of working with Carnegie Mellon University that has what they call an autonomous surface vehicle, an ASV, not to be confused with AUVs and everything else. Think of it as a robo-boat. So these water craft, if you will, that are autonomous and have up to 5 different sensors on them would be great for really high-resolution water quality mapping. But my biggest fear in deployment is that they're going to get shot, right? So thinking about the stakeholder groups, I think there's a lot of advanced education that needs to take place. I'll leave it at that.
This is David Kratfeld again with Food and Ag. I just real quick want to touch on the grass carp. We have gone through the hoops to get permission to release them in a number of places. And the 2 things we learned are that ospreys and river otters absolutely love them. So when you put several $100s worth of these fish, into a pond and then find heads 2 days later, it's a little unnerving. But my question is, I'll also say in the Imperial Irrigation District, they basically have carp shepherds. So that picture I showed, they section off, basically pastures in the within the canal system, and they rotate their flock of carp from pasture to pasture to maintain the stocking rates. But with the limited number of pesticides we have here in California, this goes both for boating waterways and my program with Hydrilla. Could you give us some insight? Is there something you could have done differently in Florida to avoid the resistance? The window for us to get new pesticides is so delayed compared to the rest of the country. That is obviously my biggest fear. And if there was something either increasing your concentrations or maintaining concentrations for more years after you quit seeing plants, rotating in other pesticides, is there any advice you can give us?
Yeah, I think, I've thought about that a lot, because what happens in an operational program when something starts working, it's what people want to use. The economics were there with fluoridone, the selectivity was there with fluoridone, the non-target, other non-target issues were not there. And I think when you started going operational at that scale, to tell somebody to come in and say, well, gee, you ought to rotate something else in, and it's going to cost a lot more, and it's probably going to have some non-target impacts that you're not as comfortable with. I think, it's kind of one of those things. It sounds good in theory, but where you can rotate, you should. But what I would say in the Delta right now is that you can't. 2,4-D doesn't control Aegaria. Diquat is semi-effective. You could rotate that in, but if you're limited to 50 acres, you better choose them really wisely. And we haven't had major issues with resistance in aquatics, but the one that we did have an issue with was the biggest program in the world. So, that was kind of the bad news. But I don't know that we could have done anything different, because the way that we were using fluoridone at that scale, we still don't know if we selected for resistance based on high concentrations in multiple areas or if it was low concentrations over a long period of time. All we know is that we did select for it. And like I said, I think your saving grace in the Delta is that you will never have those long-term concentrations that we had in Florida. Also, you don't have tubers, so you don't have a continuous population regerminating into low concentrations of herbicide. And that was the other thing that I think worked against us with fluoridone, with Hydrilla. So where you can rotate, I think you absolutely should. That's just the best way to manage. But Lars may know something different, but I don't think you have an option in the Delta with Aegaria right now, and probably won't, in my mind.
No, but I think this points out to another issue that probably should be addressed, and that is that there are research gaps that we need to try to fill. And I think that's one of the interesting puzzles about Aegaria and other species within the same family, and is why are we getting these differences in susceptibility, and is there a way to develop a little bit more in-depth research on the physiology and biochemistry of these plants to understand that a little better. And then because where we are now with the technology in the field of herbicide development, you can start looking at individual molecules and see what might fit in certain enzyme patterns and essential enzymes in those plants. The problem we have, and I think that Mike mentioned it, is you've got this tiny market. So companies are not really incentivized to spend the $100 million or whatever it takes to get a new product on the market, unless there's a big market out there. But it does point to the need for, I think, more fundamental research on how these plants work, especially within the same family when you have plants that are behaving very differently. It's pretty interesting.
Just had really one question I wanted to ask, which is, I'm Anitra Polly from DWR. I was curious, it seems like we don't really have that much data when you think about it, even though, particularly the hyperspectral data, it was discontinued for 2 or 3 years, started back up. So my question is, do we know that the population really is increasing, or is it just an effect of the drought, a recent effect, and will an El Nino event cause things to change? That's just a question that I have. What's the prediction?
I can address that only from my own observations over the last 30 years in the Delta, and that is certainly we've seen an increase in Ludwigia. And it didn't just start off and all of a sudden, boom, there it was. It was a gradual increase, but the last few years have been pretty rapid. As far as the submerged plants, there's been a lot of different studies and hydroacoustic sampling that's been done through boating and waterways. And so but I was interested, the population of the submerged aquatic plants hasn't varied all that much. It's pretty dense, but it hasn't changed, 50%, not even that much. I think those are pretty good figures. I think the question about the drought is an interesting one, and I don't have the answer except that it does two things. One is it provides warmer water earlier in the spring and probably warmer water later, but it also provides probably more clear water for light penetration and more of the habitats that are out there, so you would tend to get more growth. And what it does to we were talking about this before too, what it does to the transition zone of saline to brackish to freshwater is probably really important. Keep in mind, Eurasian water milfoil is fairly brackish tolerant, and so is sago pondweed, another native. Egeria not so much, and so the question has always come up, what happens, as I mentioned, 50 years from now? Do we start losing some of these and gaining some other ones? That's a really good question to look at.
Well, the water hyacinths used to flush out before the drought too, a lot better than they are now.
Okay. Well, the organizers are dedicated to letting people who need to go home. So, and according to my watch, we're only 2 minutes late, which I consider pretty good. So, I thank everybody for giving us loads of information and being succinct in doing so. You will have noted that we have videographers who always do fabulous work recording all this, so I'm not quite sure where the recordings will be available, but they'll include both the speakers and the PowerPoints, and will be available sometime relatively soon, and we'll certainly have pointers to them from both the Delta Science Council and the Information Center for the Environment. And then if you didn't register, please do, because we'll have follow-up email as to what's come out of this, and probably asking you for further feedback on opportunities and needs. And with that, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and note that I'm sure that people will remain and talk after we've formally ended. So we're formally ended, and thank you.